Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's product conversations. On most Fridays at noon, we bring together five or so people with opinions to dig deep and unravel the pieces of product management so that we can all understand our extremely complicated world a little better. And maybe we can do our jobs. I'm your host, May Wong. I am the resident product ops enthusiast and community product community builder. On our show today, we have Krishnapriya, on your LinkedIn tagline, you say product innovation and entrepreneurship. You're a product owner at Caseware, and Krishna also does a lot of work with local and global community nonprofits. We also have John Cutler, product stuff, ex company name, writer of A Beautiful Mess, current freelancer, quote, helping leaders make progress on thorny operational challenges. We also have Graham Reed, quote, that product operations guy. Um, Graham writes a blog called Practical Product Ops and is the founder of the Product Mind community, which is a great resource um, if you're struggling with your mental health or even just trying to figure out what you can do. And also, Graham is the co-host of the Product Ops Chronicles podcast. All right. And if Nils joins us, we'll see what happens. Okay, so this is our panel. We are going to get started. Today's topic is PRDs, or as some people like to call them, product operations. Sorry, no, PRDs, product requirements documents. And so it is a thing that comes up over and over and over again, and I've seen it in like 9,000 different iterations, and several people have asked me very interesting questions, and I'm not sure what I can do with all of this information, right? Like, so I think it's important for us to break it down and understand what we can like what is a PRD? How do we go about using it, working with it? What is a PRD? There's so many questions to start from. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around and ask you, have you experienced PRDs in your workplace or in your past experiences? And I'd like you to describe your best and worst experience of with them, but also like just give us like a bit of color as to what they were in those circumstances. So, Graham, I'd like to start with you.
Try and find my mute button. Hello. So, I mean, what's been my best and worst experiences of them? I think my worst experience is not having one or having anything like it at all. I think that's, and kind of the insistence that, anything remotely documenting, what, this a big feature, a big initiative, a big opportunity is going to look like, has just been horrific, realistically. And seeing what the end result of that looks like, staying around long enough to kind of see, well, look, if we had something like this, just documenting what this was, what it needs to look like, and importantly, how telling this story of what this is, what it's going to do, what the benefits are, to the right people, to the right audiences. Something that when I was at Cobalt last year, really hammered home quite hard is, a document that tells this story to, the wider business, to the sales, to the marketing team, have elements of that explain what we're doing and why we're doing this. Not the sole reason for the document, absolutely, but a part of that, to make sure get people involved and understand what this is all about. And you know what? It might not have been the best document. In fact, actually, I will admit I probably over-engineered it a little bit. I am very happy to admit that. But do you know what? One element I was very pleased with was actually how many people just rallied round and used this as that central knowledge base for what we were trying to work on. And so for me, that was a key and critical part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so hard to get it right, but like What it is a whole new different question, and we'll get to that shortly. But thank you for sharing your experience with it. Krishna, let's go to you next. I went around Toronto and I asked people. I ran around all of Toronto and I asked people how they like if they had opinions on PRDs, and Krishna said yes. So you must have something to back it up with that.
I'm sure a lot of people have opinions. I was just lucky to be part of this panel. Um, so I don't have decades of wisdom or gray hair to back my opinions up, but my best experience with PRDs has been when I didn't know what a PRD was. And I was just this kid who wanted to solve a problem. And so, somewhere around, I don't know, at 12 a.m. in the night, going through the snow, I had a notebook in my hand, literally writing down what the user was doing in a startup that I was trying to solve a problem for international students. That was my first PRD that I ever wrote. That, oh, okay, so the students don't check their phone. Oh, okay, okay. So I actually wrote down the user journey in a notebook, and that was kind of what I thought would become an application that would help them. That was probably my best experience because that little scraggly notebook was my living, breathing document of whatever the user needed. It was a dump all document. It had everything. It had user interviews. It had design notes. It had so if you don't know anything, you do everything, and hopefully something clicks. So it was that catch all little pocket document. And my worst experience with PRD is similar to what Graham said, was not having one and pretending that we have everything together and just building features one by one by one. I don't have to name the company or whatever that was, but it was just heads down, build, 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 and no context. Why are we doing this? What happens if we don't? What problem is it? Are we impacting the business at all? None of these questions were answered. So it was just heads down building. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to like talk about why we have these conversations in the first place, right? A lot of the times when we have any of these conversations on any topic, it always goes back to the role of the product manager. And in generally in this group, we believe that product managers are really responsible for next year's revenue, as in, like, if sales wants to make money this year, they can make money this year with what we have today. But if they want to make more money next year, they're going to need a better product, right? And it's really that like forward thinking, understanding what the market looks like and what our customers need and what our customers will pay for, and so on and so forth. So, um, thank you for bringing that up because it just it's so important. Just out of curiosity, have you worked with a document that's labeled a PRD? Yes. Okay, and how recently was this?
Like today morning.
Okay, thank you. Because a lot of the time, like people are like, "Oh, PRDs are old, aren't they?" And I'm like, "Well, it depends where you work." So you hear a lot about that. Like if you go out into the physical community with people who don't spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, they'll say like, "Oh, I'm working on this PRD," or you start job hopping, and you'll see like different people talk about PRDs very differently. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I guess my response would probably echo the folks who've already shared their experiences, is that the best times were these active documents that were being read and eliciting responses from people and eliciting feedback from people, and that these documents felt more living. Um, and I have worked with things called product requirements documents as well, but we didn't necessarily labor that point. These were just live documents that captured the current state of our questions. It's funny, I had just out of school, actually, I dropped out of school. I had a video game company and I didn't know anything about doing this. And someone said, write a PRD. And I said, well, what is it? They just said, answer the important questions. And what I just brainstormed 100 questions and then tried to answer them. And then I was probably 20 at the time. And I said, What do I do if I don't have the answer? And they said, don't make it up. Just put a question mark there. And so through this doc, it turned out to be like 100 pages for this video game. But at the end of every single page were a number of question marks. So if there were 5 question marks, that meant I had no idea about what I was saying. And if it was 0 question marks, it was like I was pretty confident about the answer to this question. And it was an active document and it was used. So I think, the best experiences, active live documents that elicit questions, are capturing the state of understanding. And then probably the worst experiences are just no one ever reads them. And they almost perpetuate siloed thinking among groups. You'll have engineers sort of heads down in promotion driven development, and they're talking to some engineering lead who's like, what's going to be my next project? And engineering lead's going to a product person and saying, I got to know what some potential new projects are going to be. Could you write it up? And then you're writing this thing and you're giving it to them, and it's getting kind of farmed out, and no one's reading it. Actually, it's just it's very sort of optics driven. So those are the worst experiences.
All right, thanks, John. It's so strange how the words that we choose to use end up driving how we start thinking about things. So we'll get back to that shortly. I'd like to introduce our fourth panelist, Nils Davis. Nils Davis. Sorry, I'm getting a feedback from somewhere. But Nils Davis, your tagline on LinkedIn is "You're amazing. Your resume should show it." Nils does a podcast called The Secrets of Product Management, and I love it. As well as Nils is also a product resume writing coach, and he's really good at it. So if you're looking for that, talk to Nils, because the job market sucks right now. All right. Nils, the question is, have you experienced PRDs in your workplace? And if so, describe your best and your worst experience with them.
Okay, so I'm super old. And so when I started product management, we wrote PRDs. And it took me a long time to figure out what they should be, what the purpose was for a PRD in a product world, right? And I mentioned in the comments on the post on LinkedIn yesterday, PRDs, we inherited from the term PRD, we inherited from the world where the customer did write the requirements. The customer in this case being the DoD, the vendor being Boeing or somebody like that building a fighter jet, say, and the requirements really were required. The requirements would say the plane cannot fall out of the air when we make a left turn inverted, right? And so the plane had to be designed and built so that was true, and they had to be able to prove that they'd tested that they'd done a design, that they'd validated the design, that they tested it, blah blah blah, right? And so that's where the term PRD, that's why the word requirement was there. Those things were required, right? And then gradually, when I think IT kind of took on the concept of the business requirement doc or the product requirement doc, because in a sense, the business would say to the IT organization, I need a new banking app. It must do these things. And that was the requirements, right? And again, the customer was defining. Well, in the world of product that we think of today, there's no actual requirements in the sense of nothing is required in a sense, right? We can choose, if you think about making an application that competes with some other application, you kind of think, well, we need to at least have the table stakes features, right? The core features. But we don't even really have to. If we have a good argument in the product for why they're not there, they're not even required, right? So there's really nothing required anymore in the literal sense of this must be there, right? So I think that the thing that's happened with PRDs, and I actually did a couple of episodes on the podcast about PRDs, trying to sort of rethink the idea of the document that sort of holds all the thinking about the product and the decision making and the design, and give somebody a place. One of the struggles that I always have in a company, when I join a company that I didn't start, right, which is all companies that I've joined, why does this thing work the way it does? This thing that I come into, what were the decisions behind it? What was the thinking? What was the customer request? What was the design alternatives, things like that? I would love to have all of that stuff captured, because it all happened, right? There were conversations about all of this somebody did design something, there was a design document typically often made, or and there were conversations, there might have been conversations with customers that drove the decision to do the thing. There were prioritization decisions. And I think having a document that captures all of that is potentially a really valuable thing for us to have as product managers. So going back to good experiences and bad experiences, never had a good experience, I would say. I mean, certainly it was for until around 2006 in my jobs previous to that, we had a literal document that was a Word document that had all the requirements in it for a particular release. And there were many, many problems with that. One is it required me to write it up and be really clear, which is I'm a good writer, but it still was hard to get everything in there and make it all clear, put all the rationale in. The bigger problem though was, we would build something, we would build a release, and we would not get everything that was in the requirements document into the release just because reality. And so then it's a question of, okay, what do I do with the things that didn't get released or that only got partially done? And this brought me to, I was very excited about when I found the product Accept 360. It was called Accept in the day. This was back in 2004 or five, and it was a product for product managers that essentially every requirement was atomic. Could stand on its own, so you could compose a PRD based on a bunch of standalone requirements, and you could. It wasn't like a document. It was like a set of things that we decided we prioritized, and you could sort of in a sense create a stack rank backlog, although it didn't support it at that time. It did later. But the idea being that the requirements were atomic. It wasn't the PRD that was the unit of work. It was the requirement. Now there's even problems with that still, but so then I joined Accept 360. I was the product manager there for a long time, and unfortunately we didn't succeed, which is unfortunate for all of you. You would all be a lot happier if you had Accept 360 to work with as product managers. And there were some learnings that came out of the fact that we failed, even though really valuable. But what I came away with was this idea of I want to focus not on the product as a whole for this document. I want to focus on the individual features. I want to capture a lot of information, including why we're doing it, why we're not doing something else, what the design decisions were, what the what the acceptance testing is, blah blah blah, all these things, many of which are noted in, or sort of listed as things that go in a PRD for a requirement, but a lot of times these relationships are actually one to many to many. Multiple requirements can be tested by one test. Many tests, multiple tests have to be done for each requirement. There's all these relationships that are not well represented in a flat document. So anyway, that's a long spiel about whatever. Didn't even answer the question, but
it's fine. I think like the concept that it's not a flat document is actually where I want to go, because no one's going to read a 40-page or 100-page document, right? Like, they're not reading it. And if there's a table of contents, they'll go to where they need to go and they'll read that. But that's not a good piece of document. So let's talk about we're gonna steer away for a bit and then come back to this. In my conversations with product managers, there are several categories of what people come across today as things that are labeled PRDs. So someone came up to me and said, May, we have this PRD, and we finished that feature maybe 3 months ago, but now we're making updates based on the learnings we have, and it's such a pain to go back and update that PRD. And I said, "W- what is the purpose of this PRD?" Because it was probably a thing that you used to basically get buy-in and actually build the thing. But are you making this the permanent record of what this feature is? And how many places are you updating this? Because they're updating the wireframes attached to this feature, and it's I feel like that's like the wrong granular place to go, right? And on the other side of the spectrum, we've got people who are like, "Oh, my parody is just a problem statement." And I've seen both in the same organization. And and as the person like going in and just like designing what say PRDs or the equivalent should look like, that bothers me a lot. And sometimes it's not even the most pressing challenge, which makes it more complicated. So, in your ideal world, right? How do you what so think about pick any workplace you've been in or like an ideal situation. Um, what would you use to do the tasks that you think a PRD performs? Um, Graham, I'm gonna go to you first.
Come back to me because I'm thinking.
Nils, you look ready. Oh,
I am always ready, man. So I mean, I feel like there's a lot of value in having an ongoing, up-to-date document for every feature or capability that can be referred to answer questions like, why did we build this? What were the decisions? What were the design alternatives? What do we think is next? What did we choose not to do because we said it's a corner case that we don't need? Um, and unfortunately, there's not really a way to do that. Human beings are not good at maintaining that kind of record. Now, I'm actually hopeful that with the help of Gen AI, you could actually create something that was that kind of repository, right? So you start from the thing you write up, which we all do write something up to begin with, and then as we build, we have ChatGPT check with us. We have an agent that comes and checks with, what have you made any changes to your thinking on this? Why did you, how did you actually do it? Give me a screenshot so I can archive that. Why this? Blah blah blah. Right? ChatGPT could actually, or an LLM or something like that could actually help with this. But the way that I do that today, or have done it in the past, is I spend a lot of time searching Confluence, or something like that, to try to find out if anybody ever wrote anything about some decision. you know like, what are the valid values for this field, right? Did anybody ever write that down? Is it documented? And I know that the list that if I find a list, I know it's not correct. Where can I find the information that tells me what was added and what was taken away and which fields are I mean, this is just one simple little example, which
yeah.
values are now obsolete. And so that's what I want.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, Krishna, what would you like? What would you do to solve the problems that you were seeing with the parodies?
So I think the original question was, what would you use if you
Yeah,
didn't have a PRD instead, right? Do you want me to
yeah,
stick to that?
yeah.
Okay.
Go for it.
Sure. I've used, surprisingly, the Jira ticket itself to capture, and I use it as a way to keep what is current, what is known, what we're working on. It's very current, and I understand we lose some past history in the process and how it happened. So the context is a trade-off. So for that, I often make a section or a separate ticket where I store I often have a ticket, like I call it the history ticket, and there we focus everything on. I know that the developers will look at Jira, not the stupid Confluence documents I make. So it's there.
It's so important to work where your audience is, because if you're building a sales tool and you make them go somewhere else, they're never going to use it. If you build it into their CRM, they'll maybe use it, right? So that thanks for that, John.
Yeah, I really encourage teams, and my best experiences have come when we just design our own templates. And this might seem crazy because you'd think, why don't you just go to Reforge and get the template? And there's actually a lot to be said for people engaging in this process. And so what we would do, I wrote this post about it called Great One Pagers, which is where this all starts. But we just start with the question, like, what questions must we answer at what times to make the progress we need to make at that time? Now, I never did that activity and ended up with fewer than 50 questions. Like, the reality on the street when you're actually working with these things is that we have lots of questions to be able to do it. Now, the interesting thing is, like, what did we call these? yeah, they sort of end up as a series of one pagers. And then I always say that, like, you could break out all product into tweet thread, one pager, 6 pager, 16 pager, 30 pager. They're all there. And maybe to Niels's point, these all become this sort of network set of artifacts. But one thing that I've discovered is that, I don't know, the mess is great. Teams just work it out. It's not like teams, although everyone freaks out about maybe not having the right template, when you look at a team that's doing well, they just organically figure this out without having to label a lot of these particular things. So they don't like fret over what they call that tweet length problem statement or user story. They just use it. So I think that the reality is that when teams are doing work well on the front lines, they evolve. They're answering 50 plus questions across 6 different or 8 different artifacts, and they're just doing the best they can to network and link these things together to make the progress they need to do it. Another point that I would add there too is I never did that activity and ended up with fewer than maybe 10 shapes of work. So if you look at the different types of work we do, ranging from, oh my God, there's a bug we got to fix, all the way to this is a multi-quarter, nebulous, weird, outcome-driven effort. If you look at all those dimensions, you never end up with any fewer than 10 shapes of work. And each of those shapes of work needs its own appropriate set of artifacts. One can be a tweet length, and one needs to be 100 pages cumulatively of all the shit people are going to write about it once you do it. And so I think that just kind of embracing that mess of the work we do and not imagining that one template will solve all the problems in your company is probably what you notice. Teams that have just figured this out, they just do this organically. Now, the questions of how to do this at scale, or when you have 100 dependencies across 150 teams, or you have 3 people in legal who need to process the work of 1,000 different people, those are separate problems, which we can talk about. But yeah, that's my answer, I guess.
Great.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the space to kind of think about this, because there's so much that's been said here, and I think I think there is a way that we should be breaking this down into 2 slices. Firstly is the technical side of things, the specification, things like the outcomes, the metrics of how we're going to measure success, all of those things. And look, the term fixed is a weird word here, because in agile world, it's never really truly fixed. But look, it's more fixed. We've got a thing, and it's probably going to end up being that thing in one shape, form, or another by the time it's out the door. Okay. The piece that I feel is much more fluid and requires more attention is more of a PR, a public relations side to this. Is how are we explaining what we're doing, the updates to it, where we are, to the non-technical audience, the commercial side of the business. They don't need to see all the technical stuff. The technical stuff doesn't largely change too much. And I absolutely slew what John's just said there, that let the technical teams figure that out. If they'll figure that part out on what it does, how it does it, everything else like that. Do we need reams and reams of documentation for absolutely everything? No. We'll figure this thing out in the different shapes, different what we've got. But the PR side of things, I think, is something that is important. It is fluid. It is something that needs attention. I would argue more attention, because ultimately what we're doing is we're selling this to the wider business. They need to be kept engaged. We've got as John said, this multi-quarter mesh nebulous project that we're working on. They need to be kept engaged. They need to know that actually it's still on track, that it is what we originally wanted it to be, so they can go and tell their stakeholders of what's going on. So now, whether this is a document or whether this is something else, that as an artifact, I think is arguably more important than anything. Is that engagement with everybody else that that keeps teams energized and keeps them engaged with what we're working on.
Yes, keep teams engaged, and also the PR. And I think, like, so kind of to pull it all together, we've got this notion of, going back to the problem statements, which is a topic we did a couple weeks ago. We want people to understand what it is that we're trying to solve, but in solving the thing that we've chosen and the thing that we prioritize, the thing that we decided was strategic, there are many, many different artifacts that are associated with this thing. And maybe all of these connected pieces together, plus like maybe some sort of pieces of communication attached to those, um, build the historical repository that we might need to come back to it in 6 months or a year from now when we're ready to do the next iteration, assuming that you didn't build in immediate learning, or maybe it's fine enough as it is, right? So there are different ways to think about it, but again, I think it really depends on your product, your market, and your organization, right? It's all of these pieces need to be thought about, at a team level, but also if all the teams are working differently, and they produce these artifacts at some point in time at a large enough size, you need to consider how are these artifacts then consumed by someone else. And so there might need to be a layer of consistency there in terms of how these then get aggregated and fed to the audience who needs to consume them, and is it in a space where they can see it? So like on the product ops forums, you'll see no one's looking at a roadmap, and it's because it's not in a space where they're looking, right? So there are things that we need to consider in terms of our counterparts within the business are also very busy, and they need access to the stuff in a place where that is really like mentally accessible to them as well. So I think,
May I just add one thing
yeah,
too.
go for it.
Absolutely what you just said there, and I think part of that as well, and it comes back to this kind of the technical versus the commercial. The technical teams, we are in nature of what we do. We are much closer to this. We have an element of control, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a very good way. In that actually, look, we can know and trust, and there's a limited scope of what the tech teams will do in terms of how they communicate and things like that. And then when we go to the other side of the business, the commercial side, we tend to be a little bit less in control of how they're consuming that information, that message. It's why we spend so long on crafting that right message, telling those right stories to the commercial side of the business and to the wider world as well, because we need to make sure that interpretation is correct. That those conversations we have with technical people, generally, we're all talking the same sort of language, things like that. When that goes over to another area of the business, it's that interpretation that's so important. And so I would agree that having an amount of standardization with that helps them consume that information more easily, more readily, on a more regular cadence.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of the other side of this conversation then, um, what does the product team actually need to produce? And who is it for? Why are we doing this? Jump in. Nils?
Well, I have a I have a template and it's not a template, it's really a rubric for the things that I think of. Now, it's oversimplified. And I was thinking about when John was talking about templates and going to SourceForge, and I was thinking about the fact that a lot of times, templates are used as a management tool, right? Um, Templates have a lot of value for us to help us think, but they can also be used kind of as a cudgel by management. I love the fact that John encourages people to build their own, because that sort of removes some of that. You're using this template because the organization doesn't trust you, versus we're using this template because it's going to help us get our job done. So that's one thing. And the rubric that I have, I call it valuable. Is it's for what I the term I use is functional specification. That's kind of like a big requirement or a component or something like that. And the big thing that it has in it, and this goes to back to my ethos of what I think product managers our role is, which is finding market problems we're solving, and then work with dev people to create solutions, right? So what I think you need to do, and this also aligns with what Graham was mentioning. You need to talk about what the problem is. What's the problem the market's suffering from? What are the symptoms? Why is this worth solving? Right? How is a solution that we create going to make their lives better? How do we talk about it? Right? Why will they love it? What are something that this solution will have that will make customers love it? How do we expect it to be used? And what are the indicators that we did a good job of building a solution? In other words, acceptance tests. It doesn't have anything about the solution itself in it at all. It's meant to engender the conversation. And then so that's from my standpoint, that's what the product manager should be sort of consider themselves responsible for, that
Yeah.
set of information. And then there's all these conversations that turn into a solution eventually. Like there's design conversations, and there's with both user experience and technical. And my hope is that all of that stuff then gets somehow connected. So that if I want to go find out, well, what was the technical design for this feature, that there's a place where I can go find that. And of course, there's also usually a lot of conversations about that. So is there a place where those conversations are at least noted, whether or not they're recorded? But what was why did we choose to go X this way versus that way in terms of a design or a user design? How did we test the designs that we came out? How did we test the user experience designs? Who was it hallway testing? Was it actual user testing? Et cetera, et cetera. So that's I think that's sort of related to your question, May. I think I answered that.
I mean, like, there is no right or wrong answer, right?
Right.
Because it's really in the context of what we do. We have to communicate to everyone, right? So what I'm trying to get is to flesh out this bigger idea of what it is that we need to communicate, and is there a way to find the really key pieces that we must communicate, like that problem statement, the functional specifications, the history. Like, think about if you've ever worked anywhere where there's a lot of people who've been there for 10 plus years. A lot of that, like when you ask a question, they say go talk to person X or go talk to Jamie. They've been there for like 20 years and they know everything about this thing. But what happens when Jamie leaves? Right. And this reliance on humans for institutional knowledge is highly risky from an operational risk perspective. I mean, you do need to rely on that people these people anyways, because like there is usually more perspective than gets written down, but if there's a place to look for it, it's at least like something, right? Krishna, I'd like to come to you for your thoughts on what does a product team actually need to produce in terms of documentation, because that's what this really is, right? Like, is this documentation?
I so to answer your question, I echo the sentiment of others here that it's a sales pitch at the end of the day. It's something that helps us sell the problem that we are trying to solve, and it may not be the right problem. I hope product managers will have the humility to understand that it may not be the right problem. I'm taking a course with Saeed Khan where he talks about how different teams have different incentives inside the organization. Product is incentivized in a different way. Sales people are coin operated, as he puts it. Marketing has a different incentive. So when we are making this document, for the lack of a better word, right now the challenge for me is to say different people have different incentives to be looking at this document. What is it that we need to put in so that there is a unified lens? The company success is our success. So what is it that we can put in? To me, that common language is business language. Everybody understands numbers. So if I tie it to something that is X number of users, which is X number of revenue that we are adding to the table, that usually makes sense for most people. I'm yet to be kind of refuted on that. On the revenue shuts everyone up usually.
Yes, common language is business language. That is beautiful. Graham, I'm going to come to you next. what does the product team actually need to produce?
Well, it's a very good point. I want to come back to some points that Niles was making. We're talking a lot about value, benefits, outcomes, which is all very good language to use across the business anyway. It's kind of almost your product management 101, modern day product management 101 in terms of what you're building. I use a lot of these things, not descriptive, but more quantitative values for these things. When we're looking at things to build, to prioritize, to to find out what we should be working on next. And so that similarity between the two there, is really very interesting, because that's ultimately what we're doing here. And we've all said this, as much as we're keeping a record of what is being done, has been done, and that's one artifact, and that is for record keeping, that's for auditing, that's absolutely as we said. So unfortunately someone gets hit by a bus, and so we can continue business continuity. Makes a lot of sense. But then actually it's almost now we're talking about justification of what we're doing, and and in some cases what we have done. Why did we spend 6 months building X? Well, look, here were all the reasons for it. And we're now talking about, actually, rather than it being potentially one document, maybe one very long document, we're now talking about a web, a mesh of information, even from different platforms, different sources. And I come back very simply to those almost those metrics that we're recording down, those quantitative values that we're recording down. At its absolute base level, this is the sort of stuff that you put against a ticket in Jira or ClickUp or whatever, if you're going down to that level. And of course, then you want to be more descriptive, and that's where you then head over to the selling side, the sales side, again, I come back to the PR side of things, about how are we keeping our users engaged? How are we selling this to the rest of the business? So I think there is a vast amount of things that we can do. I think it very much depends upon each individual business about what is important to them. I would suspect it's more the PR side of things that is going to be more universal as a need, and those other aspects will be, how do you want to do it? And I think as we've said a couple of times here already, that actually, how much do we want to stipulate upon that? How specific do we want to be? Prescriptive, to all the different teams.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing here, if you're listening and it sounds like we're crazy, and we're not getting specific, is that realistically, like, I'm going back to these activities I mentioned doing with teams. Right now in the chat, I'm sure we could brainstorm 100 different questions. Who are the users? What segment of the users? What are they paying us? What part of the app is this going to do? What risks does it relate to? Does it touch any critical piece of architecture? Are we going to introduce new parts to a data model? Do we need any types of reviews involved here? What type of risk is this? Is there UX risk involved? Is there viability risk involved? Is there adoption risk involved? What's the underlying thesis for the growth loops involved? Is this something that's going to relate to other teams? What are the dependencies on these teams? We could just go, and in about 2 minutes, you would generate 150, 200 questions. And I know, because I've kind of done that activity with teams. So one thing you can see in Graham's response is, I think that none of us want to make that list, because we feel that we would also drive you crazy listening to it. But I think that the underlying principle is, I would give a couple principles to think about. One is the difference between source of truth and presentation. You have source of truth, you have things that honestly only you would read, or maybe people close into your team would read because they're pretty dense. And then you have the recasting of that information. So for example, you could write the problem statement in 1 sentence or 1 word, or you could write it in 7 words or 7 pages. Somewhere it helps to have somewhere where at least the inside baseball people know where you're going to nerd out. And one thing I've learned is, don't invite everyone to that repository, because they will think you're crazy, because they just want the simple thing. They think that if it's 8 pages, this means it's complex. And meanwhile, you're like, no, this is reality. But if I don't have it in 3 sentences, it's going to be too hard. Don't show them the repository. Just show them the 3 sentences, but draw that from the central source of truth, right? So that's like one thing. And then I think that the second principle is step outside yourself and attend these meetings and listen to the questions people ask, and then add that to an FAQ. Like the value of an FAQ is so undersold in this, which is, and I did this with some teams once. I said, every team you go to, keep an FAQ of the questions that do come up. Again, we end up with 150 different types of questions. And yet they would tack on the FAQs to their doc. And I think that that's like a very important part of the 6-pager process at Amazon is an FAQ, or other techniques is a good way to sort of assemble the questions to do that. But yeah, I don't know if that helps, but I just for folks listening, we could make a list of 200 questions to answer, but May's was what's the important stuff, which is a very hard question depending on the audience.
It is. And so like when I go and talk to PMs about PRDs, they say, well, I actually like them because it lets me think through my thoughts and like
Yeah.
write down what I've learned and process it. Like, you don't have to show people that. You can put it in an archive where people can find it later so they can go through your madness. And it's like, no, that's what a lot of this is like letting yourself process through these very complicated and complex scenarios of like that we are solving for. Because if it's easy, then someone would have already built it and it's commoditized, right? Like, what we're trying to solve for is usually a lot more complex than that, and it's never really that cheap to solve for. Tom Saunders put an interesting comment response. It's like, I think product teams need to communicate their vision for the future, intent and opportunity, their requirements for the now. So what is like, let's use the word requirements lightly, at delivery, and a record of the past, insights and knowledge. And I think that's really what needs to be communicated, right? Or what needs to be archived. And I think taking the time to think about like, what is your intent with this piece of information? Is it communicated? Is it supposed to be the standard way we talk about the product, aka the messaging or the positioning? And really segmenting those pieces into what is your intention with this piece of communication. And instead of handing someone a 20-page document, you might just make that the first page and link to the ramblings that you might have in order to help you think through things, and also the how do we launch, this is the solution design and why we designed it this way, this is a technical design and why we designed it that way. And it doesn't have to be one thing. We have hyperlinks now. It is 2024. So I think it's worthwhile thinking about like that structure to allow people to consume as much as they A, need to consume, and B, want to consume. So that's my opinion. Okay, uh so for the people in the audience, right? Say you're at a company and maybe you just joined it, or maybe you've been there for a while, but you're facing down the expectation of this 20 to 100-page PRD, and your predecessors had spent a year going into the mountains to meditate and research, and came back with this 100-page PRD, and then they spent a year and a half building it, and now you're on the next iteration and someone expects you to do the same thing. What do you do next?
Burn it.
But like there's that cultural expectation, right? So how do you go about, what would you recommend that they do? Or if you were in that position, what would you do?
One interesting, just very tactical technique is to just wean people off of that by understanding what parts they read or whatever. I saw this person the other day and they had a long document like that, and they just interspersed using the Google Docs emoji voting that say, did you get this far? And click on it. And they just went through and they did that. And then they started talking to the people who did get that far and find out what they needed, like why they were that far in the document. And they sprinkled them all over the place. There was these little Google emoji votes all over the doc. And they looked at the comments and they looked at everything, and they just started to slowly wean people off of the parts that never get read, the parts that get adapted a lot, so they should be extracted out because they're rapidly changing. They're their own document. So I don't know. That's just a very tactical example, but that's like what someone did. I thought that was pretty smart, to be honest.
Krishna, I'm going to come to you next.
I confess that I don't fully understand the question. Can you resurface it?
So if you're a PM and the expectation is for you to do a 20-page PRD to basically document the whole thing and then hand it off to developers, or document the whole thing and then work with the developers to build a solution, whatever it might be, like what could you do?
So I guess what I don't understand is, what could I do to do what? What am I? What is my in order to?
Well, you
Is
don't
it
have to do it,
Oh,
right?
okay.
Like you the cultural expectation is this is what's happened before.
Right.
So what can you do differently to?
Oh, okay. Now I get it. Thank you.
Yeah.
In my present organization, it's primarily Jira based, and it's very Jedi, kind of like just enough documentation kind of a thing. And what I'm doing differently is I'm doing it more on the process side. So I'm having like sessions, like story sessions with my developers, where I go and tell them stories. Okay, the problem we were trying to solve is, and pardon my language, f-ups that happen where, and this is that. So the whole thing that I'm trying to do is give them enough context so that they build better. I'm not trying to do much with the product document itself, but as John said, I am taking the liberty to create my own documents. So so-called strategy documents, market research documents, where I store all my madness away and only my manager sees that, so that he knows that I'm not just playing Candy Crush in my spare time. So
I do love that. It's like, well, you are your own PM. They hired you based off your talents, and you just do it. You go do it. Like you do the way that you believe in and you think it's effective. And that's great. Graham, I'm going to come to you next.
Now maybe this is me, because I'm direct and flippant and annoy people. I'd be asking questions. I'd be looking through this and I'd be saying, who's using this? Why are we filling this stuff out? Some stuff will be obvious, where there's like a specification and that's how the developers kind of take that and turn it into what they're going to go and build. Okay, that's fine, that's obvious. But look, I want to be asking the questions: who's using this, for what purpose? And I almost would be wanting to see evidence of this, and at the same time, there will be things, I'm sure, that are not being used. Actually, so let's say we are looking at the outcomes, the metrics. What is our expected outcome from this? Okay, fine. That's a good thing to have in my book. But are we actually checking that? Are we actually then comparing that to when this goes out, when these things have been going out the door, what that success has actually translated into? Because then what's the point in even having, these success metrics if we're not even checking if we were successful or not? So, I would be asking these sorts of questions. But I think that's very much me, because I ask questions and I like to keep things as simple as possible. And if it's not simple already, then it's there's a problem for me, and so I want to ask, and I'm very happy to be told what those reasons are and that we are doing all this clever stuff with it. Fantastic. But if we're not asking those questions, we're just perpetuating something that someone did maybe years ago and actually is no longer serving that right purpose anymore.
Nils.
So kind of a tricky question for me. So at my last company, I was writing PRDs that were sort of based on my rubric that I talked about before. And then some people came up with another format that I didn't really like very much. And it's almost as though I didn't like it so much that I got laid off because I wouldn't fill it in the way people wanted it. So that's a privilege in a way, right? Well, it's not a privilege exactly, but one of the things that I did though in that process, because I thought, well, this is a learning experience. I looked at what other people were writing into this PRD template, and it was very interesting. It really went exactly to what I mentioned before. It was a control mechanism. It was not an innovative or creativity or creating great products mechanism. It was a control mechanism, and it had a lot of stuff about the business model and the expectations, and how much it was going to save us, and and how much a feature or an activity was going to save in terms of money on internal processing or whatever, and very little on what the value to the customer was, what the problem was, how we would know if the solution was good, things like that. So in this particular case, I wasn't laid off because I didn't fill them in, but it was sort of an interesting conjunction where this change happened. But I think one of the things that is true about product managers in general, I believe, is that we tend to be very adaptable. We go into situations and we make do with whatever's there. If somebody has a PRD template, to me, it's like, well, I will try to communicate the things that I think are important using this template and try to get value to the market, in whatever way works. Yeah. So that's sort of the get along to go along kind of attitude, because that's what we do all the time, right? We never have our own tools. I mean, that was a great thing about Accept that I talked about earlier. It was a really great tool for doing product management with, and there are no comparable tools at the moment for that. And so, basically, I just say you do what you do. You just do what you need to do. You try to get product management done despite whatever templates, control techniques there are, et cetera. And you do all the things that like John and Graham were talking about, and Krishna. You ask questions. You try to figure out the answers. You try to formalize things. Not formalize, but maybe templatize is even too strong a word, but learn so that you can later on apply things you learned again.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we are almost at the top of the hour. So this is our wrap-up question every month. So what is your biggest learning or takeaway from this conversation? And John, I'll start with you.
Get comfortable writing.
Yeah. Graham.
Now I'm going to say here that something that I think this is what John said earlier, or at least what he meant, was this idea of a timeline of questions, so that actually understanding what the right questions to ask at the right time. So this isn't a document whereby we need to ask and know every question up front, but actually this is something that we almost have a fairly fixed timeline of, like, oh, this is the stuff we need to know at the start, this is the stuff we need to know later on, this is stuff we need to know towards the end, this is the stuff that we go back and check at the end. I like that, actually. Of course, I think that's fairly obvious, but actually I like that kind of being spelt out a little bit, so I really like that.
Yeah. Krishna.
Yeah, if no one's reading it, it's not useful. So while it's a living, breathing document, it's also useful to have a current state in it embedded somewhere for quick reference. So
yeah. Nils?
Yeah, a couple things. One is I love John's number of how many questions there are, 150. That's it always seems like a lot, but I love the fact that we now have sort of a benchmark number, and that seems reasonable. 150 actually seems about right. I would never have, but if you'd asked me last week, I wouldn't have said there were 150. I would have said there's 20. So I really appreciate that change in my mindset, because it also sort of illustrates the level of complexity that we're dealing with in reality. Related to that, the fact that there's different levels of detail for different types of problems, again, intuitively kind of clear, but it's really good to specifically say, oh, for a defect, we only maybe have 5 questions. For a feature, we have 50. For a module, we have 150 or whatever. And it's not that mapping. And I do think that the outcome was that there's general agreement that we need something to help us with all this stuff. And it's going to be written down in some way. But there's a lot to be desired in how we access this, how it's made useful to different audiences, right? To go to Graham's point. and that we need, and that I think there was some agreement that it's good to have it be up to date in some sense, but there's not a good way to do that either.
No. And I think all of this goes back to what is the purpose of this document? And if your document has 20 purposes, then it's not serving any of them well. So I think it's worthwhile to reconsider how you approach this document that you might call a PRD, that you might call something else. But think about what you're trying to do with the work that you produce, and is there a better way of doing it for the audience that you're trying to serve? And I also really want to go back to Graham's point, which is are we aligned on our incentives across the organization to do the thing that we need to do? Because we can spend all this time building the stuff with development, but if marketing and sales enablement and whoever else we have isn't on board, then your product's not going to succeed. So I would like to thank everyone here, John, Graham, Krishna, and Nils, for joining us on this panel. I had an amazing time. I love talking about this stuff. Unfortunately, for some people in the audience, we did not get to a formal definition of what a PRD is, but I don't think there is one. There will never be one, because when you choose a definitive answer, it doesn't always work for everyone. You need to figure out what your team needs. You need to take that time and understand it. So thank you very much to everyone tuning in, and we'll do this in 2 weeks, and the next topic is product sunsetting. So if you're interested in that, come tune in. All right, thanks everyone.
Fantastic. See you all next time.
Thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.